I was just a few years into an emerging diversity and inclusion workshop presenter profession when I found myself in the middle of an existential crisis. In fact, these sort of existential crises had really guided my life basically the whole time. You see, when I was transitioning to middle school, my parents decided that they weren't happy with the test scores and the way that the school that I was supposed to be going to was performing when it came to state and national standards. So they made the decision to move me from my school, which was situated in a predominantly black area, to a good school. Now, many of you probably know what good school is code word for, but when I found myself in this white environment, I found myself outcast. I didn't talk like my peers. I didn't think like my teachers were used to me thinking. I didn't position myself in ways they were comfortable with. So over the course of the next couple of years, I learned how to navigate that space. I learned how to code switch. Code switch so much that at some point it became involuntary. I learned how to think different so that I could get approval from the folks around me. I learned how to minimize myself so I seem less threatening. I learned how to navigate that space so well that just a few years later, those same students that bullied me basically because of my race and my culture, those same teachers that ridiculed me because they didn't understand where I was coming from culturally, they all stood and applauded as I was elected homecoming king in that same community. It wasn't long before I parlayed that kind of navigating to do the same thing in college, setting a voting record as I became homecoming king there in a similar white space. So many of you are probably wondering now, where is the existential crisis? You sound like an American success story. You sound like you lived the American dream. Well, the reality is that there was no amount of navigating that I could learn. There was no amount in changing myself and putting away my culture that I could do to save me from the reality that every once in a while at my alma mater, there will be a person that would pull out of one of these really big trucks that you kind of see around campus here sometime and yell something out of their window to the effect of, "Hey, nigger, I'm going to hang you and your whole family." That happened to me and my friends so many times while we were in college that we named the phenomena motorized courage. It was that reality that there was no amount of navigating that I could do, no amount of code switching that I could do that would save me from the reality of race, save me from the reality that I was a black person in a white space that led me to that room where I had my existential crisis. You see, I was giving a talk, doing a workshop. I talked for about an hour. I talked really well too. They really liked it. Talked for an hour. We did activities. We had conversation, and we got to the end of that hour. And now as I was wrapping up, I made a realization that I had spoke for an hour. We had conversation for an hour. We did activities for an hour. And not once did I speak to people like me. No, I spent an hour speaking to people who had privilege, speaking to men, speaking to white people, speaking to people who are heterosexual, speaking to people who are Christian, begging them, petitioning them to use their privilege in a different way, or at the very least, not use their privilege in a way that was going to harm folks that we might describe as marginalized. And what you have to understand is that I found myself that day on a different college campus, on a college campus that really needed this work. You see, I was situated in a space, or rather on a campus that was one of the last to comply with desegregation. I found myself working with students who were coming to the realization that the space they were in was demanding them to do some code switching, to reposition the way they presented themselves. Not to mention, while I was there, this university did a full frontal attack on the LGBTQIA community. They prevented them from organizing the way that other students could. They prevented them from working in spaces because they didn't want those students representing the university. What I'm saying is I was right here in a space that needed this work, but I found that what I did was lacking. Around that same time, I was working on a master's thesis. I did my master's thesis on this fellow named James Cone. If you know anything about theology, James Cone is widely considered to be the father of Black liberation theology. And as I was reading Cone, I came to realize that Cone was speaking directly to many of the gaps that I was seeing in my own diversity and inclusion work. You see, diversity is about numbers. So oftentimes we have these spaces that have these histories that are usually exclusionary, right? You have an institution, you have a university, for example, who at one point only accepted certain kinds of students. And when we say certain kinds of students, what we mean is white students, mostly white male students. And so the Project of Diversity says, let's get other kinds of people into this space. Let's get some Black people in this space, some Latinx folks in this space. Let's get a few women in this space, some LGBTQIA folks in this space. What we find oftentimes is just getting those folks in that space often results in a pretty pitiful existence in that space. Well, at least for those folks. And so we transition from thinking about it in terms of numbers, because as nice as it is to have a website with diversity, a pamphlet with diversity, a company picture with diversity, the reality is those people have to live, work, and perhaps go to school there. And so we transition to this project of inclusion. Knock on your chair if you've heard the phrase, finding a seat at the table. The table is what brought me to my crisis. As I was reading James Cone, I realized that James Cone was speaking directly to the table in a way that diversity and inclusion simply could not. You see, diversity and inclusion starts with this assumption that the table is good, which when you really think about it, doesn't make any sense. You've got this history of exclusion. You have these contemporary policies that violate people's very humanity. But we start from a space that assumes that the table is good, that the table is worth sitting at. But not Cone. And so as I was reading and listening to his speeches and listening to his sermons, I realized that Cone had three things. He had a lot of things. His career spanned from the late 1970s to the mid-2010s. Okay, so lots and lots of thinking, more thinking than I can do in the remaining 7.5 minutes that I have. But if I had to boil down just three things that Cone says, the first one is that liberation is power to the powerless. What we find so often is as we're trying to navigate this space of diversity and inclusion, what we're actually navigating is a relationship between an institution and a group that we probably would often describe as marginalized. And so often the assumption is that the institution at the table holds all of the power, which a lot of times can be really crippling for the group. It can feel as if there's nothing that I can do in this space that is so determined to violate my humanity to reclaim it. Cone says that's not the way to think about it. The reality is that these groups so often have power that they simply can't see or haven't tapped into. And so the first thing that liberation does for us, that diversity and inclusion simply fails to do, that I failed to do that day, is to remind these folks that no matter how powerful and strong the table seems, you have power, and it's not a lesser power. So often it's a stronger power that we simply are conditioned, have been trained not to be able to identify. Which really parlays us into the second point. Liberation acknowledges the marginalized. In fact, the culture of liberation is the culture of the marginalized. It critiques this idea that if I go into a space that I've been told is good, that it's me that needs to change. That it's me that needs to find a way to fit at this nonsensical table. That is the table that needs to be conformed to. In reality, the types of talking that we put away, the culture that we put away, the thinking that we put away is good. Which really leaves us with a question of, what do we do about this? Which brings me to my third thing. Cone says that liberation is accomplished by any means necessary. For me, one of the biggest tragedies about American cultural consciousness is that this phrase, by any means necessary, has been reimagined and repurposed as this call for violence. Of course, Malcolm X is the person that made this phrase popular in our consciousness. And I would argue that Malcolm X is also not calling for violence when he says by any means necessary. In fact, Malcolm X is coming to the realization, or rather has come to the realization, that the people he's speaking to are living in an environment that does not care about their humanity, are living in an environment that is determined to convince these people that they have no right to self-defense. That they have no right to push back on the ways that their humanity is being violated. And Malcolm X says no. And James Cone says no. The reality is everyone deserves the right to defend themselves. And beyond that, everyone has the right to defend themselves in whatever way makes the most sense to them. Whatever way makes the most sense to their community and to their culture. And here's the kicker. It doesn't have to benefit the table. So often, if we're being honest with ourselves, the things that we have to do to reclaim our humanity don't benefit the table. I recognize that many of the folks who might be watching or maybe even present here are perhaps diversity and inclusion folks. Maybe you represent an institution and you're trying to figure out what exactly it is we could do to improve as an institution this project of diversity and inclusion. What am I supposed to do with this talk? Am I supposed to go back to my CEO or my manager or my university president and tell them we have to let the folks do whatever it is they need to do, even if it hurts us? I can imagine for many of you that probably wouldn't fly. And so you're probably wondering what exactly to do with this talk, and my answer is I don't know, and I don't want to be rude, but I don't care. Because the reality is I haven't been talking to you. No, I've been talking to the women in workspaces who are still trying to figure out Why at this late date they aren't being compensated equally compared to their male counterparts. I'm talking to those LGBTQIA students who are trying to figure out strategies to survive in that space, who are contemplating maybe a transfer pact, where they all decide to go somewhere else, write a big, nice letter and send it to the university president and send it to CNN at the same time. I'm talking to the black students who are trying to figure out how to navigate this space and keep their cultural consciousness while not being completely isolated. Those are the people that liberation focuses on, and those are the people that diversity and inclusion so often fail to say anything to. Those are the people who probably have figured out that diversity and inclusion as it manifests so often is a project of white supremacy. It's a project of male supremacy. It's a project of heterosexual supremacy. It's a project of Christian supremacy. A project to speak to the people who've been spoken to this whole time. So today, I want to say to those folks who are navigating those spaces, you have power. Your culture is good. The way that you think is good. The way that you talk is good. And you have the right to reclaim your humanity by whatever means seems to make the most sense to you. And if that means that we don't sit at the table, then we don't sit. If that means that we've decided that this table is harmful to humanity, and it's best to burn the table, then by God, liberation says, burn the table. Thank you.